Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. If I read a really good book about a historical figure, one of the first thoughts I usually have, and I think a lot of other people do too, is, why haven't they made a movie about this person? They really should. I mean, their story is incredible. The reason I think that is partly because I'd like to see this person's story get fleshed out on the big screen, but also because I think that their story is so incredible that I want it to be shared with as many people as possible. And the sad reality is, if someone's story is confined to a book, it's not going to reach nearly as wide of an audience as if it was translated to big screen. For example, the story of Oskar Schindler, a German industrialist who saved over 1,000 people in German-occupied Poland during World War II. Most people wouldn't know about him if it weren't for Steven Spielberg's film. In this episode, which is co-hosted with Jon Hagadorn from the 1001 Heroes, Legends, Histories, and Mysteries podcast, we're going to tackle this exact question. Who are historical figures that don't have a movie about them, but should have a movie about them? This is a lot of what Jon gets into in his podcast because he looks at individual biographies. And this episode is a bit of an experiment because it's not exactly me interviewing Jon, but it's us interviewing each other. And Jon's actually releasing this exact same episode on his podcast at the same time. So we're going to go back and forth. I'm going to present a historical figure, and then Jon will do the same. And we're going to go back and forth until each of us have presented 3 people. I won't spoil who these 6 people are, but just to give you a taste, they include a Viking, a spymaster in the 1500s, an explorer, a World War I flying ace, a French resistance fighter, a young woman who survived in the Amazon after a plane crash for several weeks, and a member of Russian royalty. So we had some loose criteria over who we chose in this episode. We realized that this historical figure had to have a story that would be fit for the big screen. So what I mean by that is, I love telling stories about travelers and explorers, but you couldn't make a movie out of someone who just went to a place and then went to another place and then went to another place and wrote some pretty stories. You have to have someone who overcame some sort of incredible difficulty, and their life sort of follows the typical Hollywood 3-act structure. So if you are in Hollywood and you are looking for a historical advisor for your film, you are free to contact me. Everyone else, I hope you enjoyed this episode with Jon Hagadorn. If I read a really
Hello, everyone. This is Jon Hagadorn, host of 1001 Heroes, Legends, Histories, and Mysteries podcast.
And this is Scott Rank, host of History Unplugged.
And we're inviting you to join us in a discussion where we both pick 3 movie-worthy subjects from our banks of favorite stories and make the case as to why they should be made into movies. We know that podcasts like ours get trolled often by scriptwriters and agents for ideas, so we thought we'd make it easy for them. In the process, all of you get some pretty good stories and history out of this. Scott started podcasting about 5 years ago in the middle of his history PhD program, which was focused on the Ottoman Empire. He's prolific. He's done over 280 episodes in the last 18 months and focused on everything from copyright law to medieval laws on prostitution. His stories are always interesting. He knows his stuff, and he keeps you interested. We're glad to have him as a guest today. Scott, we're going to let you start things off by giving you a chance to introduce yourself. Then we'll alternate ideas, and we'll see where this goes. The first movie idea is all yours. Sound good?
Yeah, sounds fantastic. Thanks, Jon. This is a question that I get asked a lot from people who are historical figures you'd like to see into a movie, because I think a lot of people like historical biopics. And I've thought about this a lot. Before I mention my first person, I just wanted to mention my criteria of how I thought of particular characters, and also how I think of what makes a good historical biopic and what doesn't. And the things that annoy me about what movies get wrong about history, it's not the nitpicky details. I mean, I get it. You're going to see horse stirrups in movies that are set in the Roman Empire. Okay, horse stirrups aren't invented till the Middle Ages, but you know what? You have hundreds of extras, and you can't expect them to ride a horse without stirrups. That's just how it is. Most people don't care. That doesn't bother me. That's fine. I get it. The thing that does bother me is when people who make a historical biopic, they always have to make the protagonist basically a 21st century person zapped into the past. The reason that annoys me is I feel like we miss out what history has to offer and what history has to teach us, where it really is a foreign country. yeah, people were different in the past. We might not like always how they were different, but that's just how it is. Just one short example before I get into my first movie of a movie I think that does this bad and one that did this well. There's a Crusader biopic called Kingdom of Heaven, and I thought it was terrible because the protagonist is a 21st century man who wants peace between Christians and Muslims. I think that's great in the 21st century. I want peace between religions, but they're depicting a person that just didn't exist back then. So it's not even trying to understand the Crusades on their own terms. One series that I think does a good version of history is actually the TV series Mad Men. It's set in the 1960s. The protagonist is Donald Draper. And I think it's good because it shows us how a person with the same impulses as you or I would try to navigate a world that was really different from how it is today. I mean, a lot of what Don Draper does, it's not acceptable today. Would he be considered racist today? Many people would say yes. Would he be considered sexist? All these different things. But the show isn't trying to condemn him. It's also not trying to sympathize with him, but it's just trying to show you how he was. And it's not making a lazy moral judgment. It's not zapping a 21st century person back into the time and making us feel good about ourselves. So that's where I think movies can be.
What a great point. They're not trying to fit him into a lens.
Exactly.
That's a great point you're making.
Yeah, and the good thing about television is that we have a long enough period of time with that character and with that world that we can enter into it and understand that world on its own terms. Movies don't have that much time, so they have to take shortcuts. So, sorry, that's my really long preamble. And one last thing I'll mention is I tried to make it harder on myself where I didn't choose anyone from World War II. Because there's just, you know how it is. I mean, everyone asks about World War II. World War II is great. There's a million great stories from World War II. I thought I'd mix it up. So that's my preamble. I want to mention my first person, and I've talked about this guy a lot on my podcast. He's probably one of my favorite historical figures, and that is James Holman. James Holman was a world traveler. He traveled 120,000 kilometers, or about 80,000 miles. 400,000 kilometers in the early 19th century. This is before steamship for the most part. This is before a lot of railroads were invented. He traveled 5 continents, 200 different cultures. He went to Siberia, to Brazil, to Southern Africa, to Australia, to the Balkans. And he did all of this despite the fact that he was completely blind. And I couldn't believe it when I heard his story. And there's a book about him called The Sense of the World, and I had the author of the book on my show. So I'm only going to give a very small bit of his story here. But if people want to listen more about his story, they can go to the podcast. But the nutshell is that he was in the British Royal Navy. He came down with rheumatism. He wasn't born blind, but he went blind when he was in his mid-20s. We think it has to do with his rheumatism. We're not exactly sure. And going blind at this time, I think, would have sent most people into depression because blindness at that time was associated with God's punishment or syphilis, so it wasn't respectable to go blind. You would basically be locked away at home. There wasn't Braille. There weren't resources for the blind back then. But Holman didn't think that way. He started to leave his house by using an iron-tipped stick, and he would hit the concrete pretty hard to hear a noise. And basically, he used the powers of echolocation to see his surroundings, and he trained his senses to understand echolocation and see the world like a bat or dolphin. And after a while, he could navigate through a London restaurant and find his friend there. He could find the right table by himself. If he was walking on the street, he could tell when women were crossing his path and would doff his hat to them like a gentleman. And he becomes more confident in his abilities. He learns how to ride a horse. He can scramble to the top of a crow's nest on a ship as a former naval officer. He goes to France to sample the waters for his achy joints, and he enjoys foreign travel so much that he starts to write down his notes of what other people describe to him about the scenery. He compiles his notes, publishes a book, and he becomes famous in England as the blind traveler. So just some of the other things he did is he ascended Mount Vesuvius in Italy when the mountain was about to erupt in 1821. He crossed 2/3 of Russia over land on a sleigh that was guided by a man who didn't speak Russian, and Holman only spoke a little bit, so the two of them had no common language between them. He went to the gold mines of Brazil, he went to the jungle of Siberia, or jungle of South Africa. And just one last story that I'll mention of his life. He went to Sri Lanka, and villagers told him that there was an unruly elephant that was stampeding, and he was pretty competent with a shotgun. So he went into the jungles. He heard this elephant charging from very far away. He raised up his rifle and he took one shot and he brought it down. So he's probably my top person of why on earth hasn't there been a movie about him? Because he blows my mind about not making excuses and achieving incredible things because he refused to make excuses about why he can't do something when anyone else in his position probably would.
Yeah, great. Two questions. What a fantastic story. I've got two questions for you. What was the limit of his blindness, number one? And number two, did he have an assistant that could help him with any of these things?
Yeah, the limit of his blindness, he was completely blind. He had no sight whatsoever. In terms of assistance, he did not. He traveled solo throughout almost all of his journeys, and there were many times when he would first encounter people until he became a celebrity and they knew him as a blind traveler. They had no idea he was blind because he was so able to navigate a room, to walk around. And once he began talking with them and asking about physical descriptions of things, then they would realize it. But yeah, many people didn't know this because he was so able at getting around by himself.
That's an amazing story. You said there's a good book out there, and that's called The Source of the World?
It's called A Sense of the World. I think the author's name, I think it's Jason Roberts, the author, but highly recommended. It's one of my favorite books.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for sharing that story. That would make an excellent movie. Now, I've got one for you.
All right.
This is about a 17-year-old girl named Julianne Kepke. Have you ever heard of her?
I have not, no.
It's the most incredible survival story I've ever come across. She's 17 years old. She's on a plane flying over the Peruvian jungle. The plane is hit by lightning. She's on the plane with her mother at the time. It was Christmas Eve, and they were flying into another city in Peru to see her dad for Christmas. And lightning, they flew through a storm. Lightning hit the plane, and the plane literally broke in half a mile up, and the plane crashed. The next thing she knew, she was regaining consciousness on the ground in the Amazon rainforest in Peru, and there were corpses all around her and plane parts and seats, and there was no one moving, no one living. She had a gash on her right arm, she had a broken collarbone, and her right eye was pretty much closed. And as she started to gain her consciousness and get her senses about her, she realized that she still had to unbuckle her seatbelt, she had gone with a whole row of seats. She had been in one seat, but apparently there was 3 other seats to one side of her. She was on the end of one side, and those had also come out. She'd apparently been on that seat. She gets her consciousness, and she understood Peru. Her mother and father were biologists, and they worked they were both doctorates, and they both worked in a wildlife preserve in the Amazon River Valley there, and they pretty much had taught her the ways of living in that area from the time she was a young girl. So she knew she was in a bad shape and very much alone. There were no other survivors. She was the only one. And she spent the first 2 days looking for her mother. The people who had fallen from the plane were in pretty bad shape, as you can understand. She was finally able, after the end of the second day, to find her mother only because of the type of toenail polish that she wore when she saw her mother's feet. So imagine most people in that situation, all alone in the middle of the Amazonian rainforest, with no tools, nothing. She was lacking one shoe. She had a dress on. She had no purse, no matches, no food other than some candies that she had taken from some of the